Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today called Food and Enterprise: Meals on Wheels Services and Community Food Businesses from Around the Globe. My name is Maddie Gurlane. I work at Sustain, and I'm just helping out with some of the logistics this morning, getting our webinar started before we go over to our main presenters. So the first thing I want to do is, if most people can hear me, the best way we like to test the sound is to ask you to just write in the attendee chat. So on your screen on the left-hand side, you'll see a list of everyone who's joining in. We're at about 32 people. Next to that, you can up at the top click on attendee chat. So if you can hear me, could you tell me about where you're listening from and what you had for breakfast this morning, perhaps. We'll just go with something easy. It's over on the left-hand side of the screen. If you're having any connection issues, we always recommend using Chrome. That's the best one for any meeting, or downloading the app, but that's probably where you are already. Great, so we've got Suzanne's in Aberdeen. She had shreddies. Alex is in Guernsey and had Greek yogurt. Tilly's in Gloucestershire, muesli and fruit. Hey, Tilly. West London, Alexandra, Greek yogurt. Okay, Greek yogurt is a popular one. James is in Bristol and ate eggs. Fantastic. Wow, this is great. Someone says they can hear me better than yesterday. I'm imagining Liz is in Manchester. We were on a call together yesterday. Fantastic. And someone's even listening from France. She had bread. And I just have to say, Christina, welcome from Namibia. She had an orange for breakfast. Wow, it's fantastic. We love doing these webinars because it's a really great way to connect with people from all over the world today in particular, which is fantastic. So thanks for letting me know you can hear me. That's great. I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping things, and then we'll get into the details of this. So as I said, we've got this attendee chat on the left-hand side with the chat bar. You can use this to chat with other people in the webinar who are attending, and we often find the webinars are a really great opportunity to kind of exchange details with other people, mention projects you're working on in your own areas, let them know. If you want to share email addresses, that's fine. Sharing links is always great. It's public, everyone can see this, but we also always try to repeat any questions out loud for the recording, because the webinar will be recorded and you'll see the slides with the sound recording. So if you have any questions for the presenters, that's where you can put it. Myself, as well as the other 3 people on the webinar, the presenters can all see that chat. And when we get to the Q&A, we'll read those questions out loud before asking the presenters to respond to them. At the top of your screen, there's also a button that's called Ask a Question. It's a green button. If you want to send a question just to the presenters privately, you can use that button. And you're welcome to do that, but we kind of encourage, if you want to do anything that you don't want other people to see, but we do quite encourage people to use the public one because it's quite nice for everyone to kind of get to see what other people are thinking. As I said, the webinar will be recorded. It includes the sound, it includes the slides. It's not quite a PowerPoint, so the links don't work. So we'll normally, what we do after a webinar is we email everyone who's registered and not just attended with a link to the recording, and then any other relevant links that might come up during the conversation today. And we'll also put this up somewhere on probably one of Sustain's websites, or I'm not sure where. Simon may be able to speak to that. Finally, we often find it best to answer most questions together in a group during a Q&A at the end of the webinar, once we've heard from all of the speakers. But that means that we welcome them to come in anytime in the chat, and we'll just keep track of them so that when Caroline is hosting the Q&A towards the end, we'll just have a sense of those in advance a bit. So put them out there as you have them. Sometimes if it's just a link or something, or one of the other presenters might just jump in and send something to you immediately. But if not, we'll try to ensure it gets addressed during the Q&A at the end. And just to say, I said my name's Maddie at the beginning. I'm helping out with the tech on this. I'm based in London, despite the American accent, and I work at Sustain along with Simon, which is it's called Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming, and it's a charity that's based in London, works around the UK with a little bit of European and international work around sustainable food and farming stuff. So that both policy and campaigns work. So that includes projects like the Real Bread campaign, which supports bakeries around the world. It includes Capital Growth, which is our urban food growing program in London, Food Power, which Simon and I both work on, which is around food poverty and supporting long-term sustainable responses to that in the UK. We've got loads of different projects that we do right now. We are all in uh, rapid response mode, I'd say, with the current situation globally, and making sure that people in the UK who are the most vulnerable are getting access to good food still. So that's a tiny bit about Sustain. I'll just pop a link in the chat in a minute to let you know a bit, so you can check out our website later on if you want to. But we're always welcome to hear from other people. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Simon to take you guys through the rest of the webinar.
Thanks, Maddie. So today, myself and Joe Hayward are going to be speaking about our fellowships, our Churchill Fellowships, and Caroline is kindly going to facilitate the question and answer session afterwards. This webinar has been in the calendar for some time, so we did want to keep it in there because we think it is important to carry on with some of our pre-planned work. But as Maddie said, in the current situation, Sustain, like other national organisations, is taking action to start to support local areas responding to the current situation, as well as channeling issues and concerns that are coming up from local areas back to government and other decision makers. And I think I'm sure that some of you joining today are involved in the sort of frontline response to the emergent situation. And I think I just wanted to take an opportunity to acknowledge and thank you in particular for that. What we're seeing in the current situation in the UK and around the world is some really inspiring responses from communities and partners, but also it is flagging major gaps in our food system, particularly for those who are most vulnerable or have difficulty accessing the right food and right diet. So mine and Joe's fellowships didn't focus on people's access to food in a crisis situation primarily, but we have both been reflecting a little on how our fellowships have some learning that is relevant or potentially relevant to the current situation. So we will build that a little bit into our presentations, but also that can be part of the question and answer session towards the end. So before I do my presentation, I just want to hand over to Caroline, who's just going to say a little bit about the Churchill Fellows.
Hi, so I'm Caroline Deal. I run a network of people who are founders of charities and social enterprises called the Social Founder Network, and I'm also chair of the TV channel Together TV, which used to be called the Community Channel, and I'm the founder of the Media Trust and the TV channel too. So yeah, we all three of us went on these amazing Churchill Fellowships, and I really recommend if you haven't already applied for a fellowship and gone on one, that you have a look at it and see if you can go, because it's a great experience. So it's the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, which was funded by the public when Churchill died. They wanted to pour money in, like when Diana died. And they used their money to give travel grants to people from the UK to research a cause or a social issue that you already know about and care about. And they will fund you to spend up to roughly 2 months overseas. You can go to one country or you can go to 2 or 3 countries, and you go there to meet experts in your field, to visit projects, and to learn about a specific new idea. The whole purpose of the fellowships is to bring back skills to the UK. It's not about going out and being, doing good out there somewhere. It's about learning from the skills and the experience and the brilliant new ideas that people have got in other countries, bringing them back to the UK to add value here in the UK and to make change happen. And dissemination is a big part of the fellowship. So it's not about just going off and having a good, interesting time. It's about bringing back those ideas and disseminating them. You choose your own topic. You choose where you want to go. It can be somewhere very nearby, like Ireland or France, or it can be the other side of the world, or it can be a mixture. Should we move on to the next slide? Yep. So have a look at their website. It's wcmt.org.uk, and they're open for applications now for 2021. The application period is between the 30th of April and the 15th of September. It is quite competitive, so you've got to take quite a lot of time about putting in your application, research what other people have done, find out the kind of projects that they like to fund. We were incredibly privileged, the three of us, to be 2019 Churchill Fellows. There's also, it looks like there's a really nice network of fellows, actually. So you join a club once you've got your fellowship. Okay, I think that's enough. Otherwise we'll run out of time.
Thanks very much, Caroline. So I'm going to talk about my fellowship first. So through my work at Sustain in particular, I've been championing Meals on Wheels services in the UK for a number of years. Sustain has published some case studies of 6 great services in the UK, and I think it's important to acknowledge that there are some good services in the UK and some really trying to take on developing and maintaining services in quite difficult circumstances, particularly with the squeeze on adult social care funding. So my trip overseas was to try and see how different services operate, with a particular focus on enterprising solutions. The three of us are funded by the Churchill Fellowships to particularly look at the enterprise element around projects. So I did set out with a particular focus on social enterprises, sort of independent social enterprise organizations. But actually during my trip, it emphasized how much an enterprising approach can be taken by services of different types, whether they're run by councils, charities, social enterprise, or indeed in some cases consortiums of different types of organization. So I'm going to quickly talk through the services I visited and some of the context around them in some cases. It's going to be fairly quick given the nature of today's webinar, but there's a lot more information in the report I'll be publishing later today. Then I'll come to sort of my findings and recommendations and some initial reflections on the emerging Meals on Wheels responses we're seeing currently in response to COVID-19. So I visited France, Italy, and South Korea, and I was particularly interested in where place-based responses were part of responding to older people's access to food, particularly Meals on Wheels, looking at where there are opportunities to be enterprising, and by that I mean to have that sort of slight business-minded approach to work, but also obviously meeting people's needs and maintaining value for money as well. And I was interested in how government councils and the public sector organisations could support enterprising services, but as I have just said, actually some of those actors were also very much involved in delivery as well. And given the need for an increased focus on prevention in the UK, I was particularly interested in services that were trying to take a preventative approach. So my first visit was to Paris, where the Ville de Paris, which is the council for the city of Paris, funds a Meals on Wheels service as well as a fairly large-scale food assistance program across the city. And then Saveur and Vie is their principal contract for providing the meals, but they also have 19 meals suppliers within their networks that provide different kinds of meals for the older clients. According to dietary requirements, cultural needs, etc. And the scale of the Paris service is impressive, with 1,800 to 2,000 meals a day delivered. That's breakfast, lunch, and evening meals. And really interestingly, they use 50 of these bikes, photographed here, for those that can see the slides, to distribute the vast majority of the meals. They do use a couple of vans for Montmartre in the north of Paris, where there are lots of hills for anyone that doesn't know Paris, so the bikes found that a bit difficult. They have price reductions for some people on a low income, and they also use an app to monitor clients' welfare. So just responding each time they deliver a meal to 5 questions, and that information could be shared with social services and or family members, sort of as appropriate to the consent that has been given. And I think what's interesting about the whole, one thing that's particularly interesting about the approach to food assistance in Paris is that it's very much linked in to the city's wider pledges around moving towards a more sustainable food system. So these are actually photos from one of the communal restaurants in Paris, where MSC certified fish is being served on the left-hand side there, and then organic bread rolls are served across there. Food assistance restaurants, and this is integrated within other food offers such as Meals on Wheels. So interesting to see how Meals on Wheels delivery can be part of a city maintaining its pledges and going further than its pledges on moving towards a sustainable food system. I then went to Metz in the east of France, just on the border with Germany and quite close to Switzerland as well, where AMAPA, which is a social enterprise care provider, and it's one of its sister companies, Dr. Gestio, provide a Meals on Wheels service in different parts of France, but this one in the local authority area around Metz. So it's a sort of historic town in the east of France, but has a lot of more dispersed and some rural communities around it in the local area. So they deliver about 4,000 chilled meals a month to people. They had taken on a service that was delivering hot meals. It wasn't working for them. So they moved to a chilled meal service, providing lunch and evening meals to approximately 230 people a day. And they, because it's chilled meals, they only need a small number of vehicles to deliver those to people. They have a 50% subsidy for those on very low income and 20% subsidy for those on a low income. And they carry out what I would call fairly standard welfare checks. I think one interesting aspect of this service is that here the photo is of a chef preparing the meals for delivery in one of the care homes that AMAPA runs. So as well as cooking for, it was a large nursing home with 80 or so residents. They also at the same time are using that kitchen to prepare meals for delivery that day. And I also had the pleasure of eating in this care home, and I have to say it was a very, very good meal. And then this is one of the vans that AMAPA use to go around their county area as well as the city itself. I then went over to Milan, where the Milan City Council, Milan Restauration, which is a social enterprise trading company, 99% owned by the council, and a consortium of third sector organisations, including Sfera Onlus, which is the organisation I visited as well, deliver the Meals on Wheels service together in a consortium. So this was a really good example, I think, of the council playing a role in terms of funding and commissioning a service. Milan Restauration, although it's owned by the council, is its own sort of independent enterprise. And then the third sector organisations closest to their communities around the city had come together to bid for different contracts to deliver in different parts of the city. And they deliver about 800 mostly hot meals a day, but people can request cold if they prefer. They are lunches, but as you can see from this photo of meals in the container that they're delivered in, that they deliver a good amount of food. And I think particularly we know that some older people's appetites are not necessarily enough to have one big meal at lunchtime. Food can be eked out as appropriate throughout the day. And I'm very conscious that, you know, some Meals on Wheels aren't very easy to take nice photographs of, but I thought it was important to show actually how these meals are delivered. So each van goes out with somebody delivering about 30 meals each, and the cost of meals to individuals varies according to need and income, and some free meals are provided. And again, they use fairly standard welfare checks. And then this is an Italian, and very small print, so I wouldn't expect anybody to necessarily understand or be able to read it. But this is about Milan Restauration, that is the public sector owned trading company that cooks not just Meals on Wheels, but also all the school meals for the state schools in Milan, as well as some other hostels and care facilities. So the big figures really that I really wanted to emphasize were that they cook 85,000 meals a day, and that's 17 million meals a year. So I did visit the kitchen, one of their very large kitchens that I was extremely impressed by in terms of how food is produced, a very efficient supply of food, always moving forwards, as it were, through the kitchen. So they, for example, they have double-doored ovens, so you put the raw meat in on one side of the oven, and then there's a door at what we would think would be the back of the oven for when the meal is cooked, and it can be taken forward and prepared. They prepare their own meatballs, fish cakes, etc., in-house. So that's partly, particularly to give reassurance to parents that the school food they're producing is of good quality. But it was a great example of how a Meals on Wheels service is just a small part of what they're producing, but is part of them really maintaining an active and sustainable business, basically, in terms of preparing meals. And I just wanted to add in a bit of context about Milan, that there is a big study going on in Milan of older people's eating habits run out of the University of Bicocca. And I thought this was an excellent example of academia looking at older people's food habits and needs across the city, and then feeding into the council, other providers, about what people's needs are, and also talking to industry about how to present food that is better for older people in a way that isn't stigmatizing. It just happens to be healthier rather than being sold necessarily as a special product for older people. And also in Milan, there's a social supermarket that is similar to ones that exist in the UK and other countries, but they do have a quite a large number of older people shopping in these social supermarkets run by Solidando, which is perhaps different to some countries where we know that older people aren't necessarily going to food banks or other kinds of more immediate food aid provision. So having had a great time in France and Italy, I then went to South Korea, where I must admit it was much more unknown in terms of what I was going to see and visit, but I had a plan, but it was very much speaking to people, finding out about other things they thought I should visit, and it was quite spontaneous in terms of how my research was conducted. So this is a photo from a senior welfare centre in the northwest of Seoul, and this is a meal ready for delivery. As many of you will know, I'm sure, Korean meals are centered around rice, and then they have what are called side dishes to go with that. So you can see those on the right-hand side. So there will be meat, fish, tofu as the protein, but also vegetables. You can see the kimchi on the right-hand side there, the fermented cabbage, and some other vegetables as well as fruit. And, I think every service struggles in the current climate to reduce their plastic use, for example. So you can see there is plastic being used here, but they are using the reusable tiffin tins to pack up the food. And because in Korea, having the rice and the separate side dishes is so important, it's really important that the meal doesn't arrive at someone's house with all the food all mixed up, because that is just not how you eat in Korea. You have your rice and you take a bit of each dish. So that is why things are packed up as they are. But they were exploring other ways to try and reduce their plastic while still maintaining that important aspect of eating. Meals are delivered on these bikes, approximately 90 meals a day, lunches a day, because there are also 600 people eating at the senior welfare centre. So the meals are prepared in the same kitchen and delivered out. Some the odd meals were taken by hand by volunteers as well. There's a modest price of about £2 a meal, and recent council money had been put in to increase the range of meals. And again, they use quite standard welfare checks. But again, this was a collaboration between the Senior Welfare Centre, the Metropolitan Government in Seoul, and the Seoul Welfare Foundation, that's a charity that was involved in running the pilot and evaluating it. And just to provide a bit of context, in Seoul, I visited Food Smiles, that is an organisation that delivers monthly food delivery to older and some other vulnerable people. So this is just the ambient goods, so the eggs, the rice, and some dried products. This was supplemented with fresh products as well. And again, in Seoul, this is another social supermarket that, to be honest, looks very much like a normal shop, but again, used a lot more by older people than I think perhaps in the UK and other countries. And older people being quite strategic in terms of knowing what was going to likely to be available in the social supermarket that they could get at a good price and what they could get at the market. So not totally relying on this, but really helping older people in Korea who do have ongoing issues around pension and poverty to really make the most of the modest budgets they have. Then lastly, I went to Gwangju in the south of South Korea. This is the Hanam Welfare Center, which has state government support to provide lunch to older people in the center, but also deliver 3 days worth of side dishes to older people in their own homes with the expectation that they would cook their own rice and the side dishes that are more than just side dishes in the way that we might understand that in the UK. So that older people are still preparing some of their meal, but the more complicated side dishes that, to be honest, take quite a lot of work to prepare can be done by somebody else. And alongside sort of proper nutritional screening, they also had what they called a kimchi welfare check. So kimchi, the fermented cabbage side dish, is eaten with most Korean meals, and the person delivering the meal would go in and check if people's kimchi was going down in their fridge as a what they saw as a very accurate indicator of whether someone was actually unlikely that someone would be eating well and not eating their kimchi with those meals. So I thought that was interesting as a quick way for delivery staff on a regular basis to just check if somebody is eating. And I'm just sort of wondering what the equivalent for the UK might be alongside proper nutritional screening. So I'll just very quickly talk about my key findings. So I sort of summarised my reflections on my trip in 4 ways. So I think how important it is to have ambition for the quality of reach of services, and I don't necessarily mean in terms of those running services, because I think there are some extremely committed people, but also commissioners, councils, other funders, health services, really seeing the value of a Meals on Wheels service as we go forward into the 21st century, and people talked about having a good service in their area was like a badge of honor, and that how important it was for the meal to be good. If it's not tasty, people won't eat it. And I think there are certainly some lessons for the UK in terms of different meal provision. Obviously, there are some great meals provided, but not all, unfortunately. Generally, in the 3 countries I visited, there was just a belief in the value of prevention, and funding was put behind that belief. And in the UK, I think we do struggle to actually resource proper preventative work in terms of particularly older people's nutrition. So just recognizing that it's not by no means just about the food that's delivered. Food influences how people act and interact with other people. There's a social element, and that people genuinely believe that was a way to avoid people falling into crisis. Then thirdly, this real need to take an enterprising approach, and also providers, charities like Sustain, getting organised to champion services and innovate. So my recommendations make more sense, to be honest, I think, in the main body of the report, but they are recognising that ultimately there is a funding crisis in terms of adult social care. We have seen some moves being made by government in England, at least, to increase the budget for social care, but there still is ongoing significant issue around funding. But I did also think it was important for providers, commissioners and partners to have what I call a shared recipe for success, in terms of identifying and meeting people's needs, promoting services, making sure they have a good reputation, ensuring there is good quality of food and a good delivery service, responding to older people and other people's feedback, and really importantly, I think, supporting the local economy in terms of good jobs that can be provided via these services. So some of the best services in the UK do pay at least the living wage as accredited by the Living Wage Foundation. I do think the sector could pick up a challenge around sharing experiences a bit more and really developing a joint case for support. And I think others might be able to fund innovation for shared challenges that services face, not just in the UK, around that packaging issue I mentioned, or how to use technology in the way that Paris is using its app. So just quickly, some reflections I've had on what we're seeing now in terms of the current response to COVID-19. We're seeing lots of services pop up around the country to meet older people's needs in this extraordinary situation. So that's communities, charities, councils, food distributors and producers all collaborating in different ways. And I think it is really inspiring, but it does make me sort of reflect on how that can be done in the most efficient way, but also potentially, and there's a big caveat in this, that I know we're in a sort of crisis situation, but how can that help us get to a better longer term situation in terms of older people's access to food? So I think it's just important for people to think about what role councils, housing associations, mutual aid groups and others can play in identifying people in need while also protecting and safeguarding. We are in a difficult situation, but I do think the value of more than a meal mustn't be forgotten. How could discrete welfare checks still be maintained on the doorstep in the social distancing world that we live in? How can we still ensure that meals are nutritionally appropriate and for older people, bearing in mind that they have different nutritional needs and aligned to the Eat Well plate as appropriate? Are there opportunities to decrease older people sometimes feel a stigma around accepting help in general, but also meals cooked by others? So important to kind of maintain dignity as much as possible in a crisis situation. Then I think there are common barriers that organisations and others are going to face, even in a crisis situation. I think it's so important to try and help people not to reinvent the wheel, and we will certainly be playing our role in sharing how each area that we're aware of is tackling some of these issues around skills, knowledge, access to vehicles, parking permits, packaging. And then, yes, these last two questions, thinking about how can the more emergency response now help us gather information, data, and test approaches that could help us create some longer term responses to older people's food insecurity, which is going to be an ongoing issue after the current crisis, and how much can services be used to benefit existing food providers and outlets and safeguard jobs in the short term, but again, in the longer term as well. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've spoken a little too long and hand over to Joe. We're just going to wait for Joe to come.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, sorry about that. I am Joe Hayward. I'm going to quickly take you through my research as well. I may fade in and out slightly because of the ropiness of my internet connection, so apologies for that. So my name's Joe. I've been working in the impact investing sector for a while. I'm a big fan of social enterprise. When I looked at Churchill, I thought this would be a great opportunity to go back to South America, having lived there in the community food enterprises. I have a particular passion for social enterprises and food, and I thought, how can I look at food enterprises generally and the barriers that they are facing to grow? I had heard that there were quite a lot of social enterprises in South America that were successfully growing and reaching scale. So my focus really was looking at that question of how do you grow these community enterprises, but without losing their public benefit, without them turning into purely commercial entities. So I'm going to whiz through what I did and what I found in the next less than 10 minutes, hopefully. And I would say perhaps first to start with a definition that what I was defining as a community enterprise in this context, it was everything from that is organizations run by communities for their benefit and which are involved in growing, harvesting, processing, distributing, selling and serving food. So these are enterprises that are seeking to tackle all kinds of problems to provide healthy, affordable food, produce it sustainably, tackle food waste, etc., etc. And by scaling, I meant organisations that are greater than £1 million, $1 million in turnover. So that was my starting point when I was looking at this. In numbers, I did look at the UK first. I wanted to focus on what kind of good examples there were. So I looked at 10 social enterprises, 8 finance and support providers, and then in Bolivia and Peru spoke to 20, 11 finance and support providers, 7 farms and 2 processing plants. Spent a lot of time on the back of a motorbike in Bolivia and Peru. It was absolutely fantastic and tasted a lot of really wonderful produce. One of the things I learnt was that there's a huge amount of very good practice in tackling all kinds of different problems. And so I just wanted to highlight 3. One is Sutton Community Farm, who are producing better food while improving community cohesion in urban settings. There's Alicia, which is a catering company that uses local and in-season surplus produce. And Nemi Teas, which is a tea company employing refugees to help them in. Other examples that I found. What I really liked about the food sector in the UK is that there's but it's always very driven by the entrepreneur. So it's usually somebody who had an idea or a bee in their bonnet about something that wasn't right in the food system, and they got up and they did something about it. So when I researched the UK side, and in my report, at the back of my report, there's the 50 food enterprises that I came across. And so you can look at that list if you're interested in finding out more. But what I found was that although they have such a high impact, these community enterprises, 2% of them turn over more than £1 million. And that is, even in that case, they're very limited by in their financial sustainability. So the barriers that they face, and they all seem to have very common problems: access to market, the leadership. They often preferred to focus on small rather than growing. Access to the right capital and support to survive and grow, and the dilemma of retaining a community focus if you are trying to grow. So they have in common. Another interesting thing I learned, which really kind of was a turning point in the research, was the difference that an impact model makes. Or if you're having an impact through your supply chain, your growth pattern and your development is going to be completely different than if you're having impact through who you employ, or if you're having an impact through the profit. So it sounds obvious, but when you think about it, it's easier to give their profits away. Community farms who are producing food that have, than it is to grow Nemi tea, which employs refugees, or than it is to grow Make It, which provides food kits to people in disadvantaged communities. And so, again, there's more about that in my report, but I think that's probably something that the support sector and the investment sector doesn't take enough into account. So coming back from a whistle-stop tour of all these community enterprises, what I learned was I found there had to be 3 recommendations that were necessary for the sector to improve and grow. One is you'll all know fair trade, but you may not all know bisocial. And really, the bisocial movement is in its infancy. If we can grow the bisocial movement, which is in SEUK, Social Enterprise UK, we can start to really see the growth of demand in such products and such enterprises. The second is retail academies. So there should be a growth in the amount of support that's provided for community food enterprises so that they can grow, so that they can access UK supermarkets. The 6 massive supermarkets are extremely difficult to penetrate for these smaller entities. Research, I have found that there are 3 retail academies that are actually doing just that. One is Asda, one is with Sainsbury's, and one is the Co-op. So things are starting to change. And linked to that, supermarkets should show the way. There is an ethical consumer listing, which shows the good practice of supermarkets, and really buying from social enterprises should start to be part of the ethical consumer listing. So those were my recommendations. And I guess what I really wanted to say is that since the beginning of the COVID crisis, all of these community enterprises are reinventing themselves, playing interesting roles. Community cafes reinventing themselves into food distribution entities. They really are picking up very, very well. And I think for me, that is a clear sign that they are operating at the heart of our community and really need the support that is necessary to improve and become sustainable. So that was my research in a tiny nutshell. And I hope if you are interested, you can read my report. Thank you.
Fantastic. So this is Caroline speaking now. I'm going to moderate the Q&A. Can you hear me okay, first of all? Everyone? Yes, lots of yeses coming through. That's good. That's great. So thank you very much to Joe and Simon. They're great talks, very fascinating. We want to find out a lot more now. We're going to go first of all to any questions that come through and then come back to you. I've got loads of questions to ask you as well. But we had a question quite early on from Madeline Bowes, who asked, I think specifically for Simon, about Meals on Wheels. How did the different Meals on Wheels schemes get along with the local businesses who they might be undercutting? And what were the means testing measures, if any, e.g. low, very low budget, Madeline says, and in the different models?
Sure, yeah, I think there is an emerging market of takeout meals or ready meals that in France and Italy, Meals on Wheels services might compete with in some way, but it certainly wasn't something that came up as a tension. I think there was just sort of an acceptance that these services exist, and I guess particularly in Milan, it's about a public sector owned enterprise providing good quality jobs as well for preparing food for lots of different public institutions. So it wasn't something I picked up on at all. And I think actually then in Gwangju in the south of Korea, the service that provided side dishes to older people who were preparing their own rice, they were from a particularly disadvantaged community with very limited access to prepared food anyway. So I think some people might call that some sort of food desert, but I don't think that sort of competitive issue was one, but I appreciate the question and how it might be an issue in some countries or places. In terms of the means test, it was done in different ways. I must admit I didn't look into it in great deal because as people were talking about how the tax system in France means that you can apply for various reductions to your tax bill on the basis of being someone in need and accessing a service like the meals delivery services I visited. In Italy, it was a bit more like a UK assessment in terms of what is someone's need, but also what are their financial resources to pay for a meal. In Korea, it was a subsidized service with pretty much everyone paying the same price with some free meals, done in a way that was anonymous, so that everyone kind of had a voucher to pay for their meals, but no one would know whether they'd be given that for free or not. A bit similar to how some free school meals systems operate now in UK schools.
Okay, so keep typing in your questions. We don't have any more questions at the moment from you guys who attend. Here's one that's just come through from Diana Garduno, and Diana says, considering the importance of being involved in decision making and taking part in community life for ensuring people's dignity, which of the examples you researched do you think supported customers' dignity the best, and why? I think that's a question for Simon.
Yeah, sure. I think there was some interesting examples of how different services got different bits of feedback from people and delivered services in dignified ways. In France, there was a sort of for AMAPA, they had a formal, they call it a commission of clients and families who sit on a monthly meeting to review food and some level of sign off in terms of meals. Um, and I think what also was an important consideration, I think, in Korea was for perhaps older people of perhaps in their 60s and 70s also being involved in preparing meals, whether through a paid scheme or in some cases volunteering as well. So I think there was an important element in Korea of people being involved in providing for themselves or others like them, or how they might be in 10 or 15 years' time.
Great. And there's another question for Simon about the need to mobilize civil society to campaign for more widespread Meals on Wheels services. And did you see anywhere on your travels where they particularly got this right, and how and why this worked?
That's a really interesting question, because I think in the countries I visited, there was a general understanding that services should exist and were experiencing some tightening of public sector finances where they were uh, receiving some public sector money, but still being commissioned on much longer term contracts with the option of extensions. So actually, it was less of an issue. I think what there's perhaps been more activity on in particularly Korea was around age-friendly cities and the need to shape cities to be more accessible and conducive to older people living, particularly with the sort of meteoric development that South Korea has seen, with cities being very fast-paced and built for younger workers predominantly. So that, I guess, is where the attention was more than on the need to campaign, as I understood it, because they're in a different place, I think, than we are in the UK, the three countries I visited. Although they did say that in Paris and Milan, they were more exceptional in terms of their respective countries. So perhaps if I'd been to other places, I might have seen a more civil society activism alongside services.
Yeah, we've got another question for Joe, but just there's one more for you, Simon, that I think we'll just pick up because it's linked to the campaigning, which is a question from Lauren Foster. Are any of the Meals on Wheels services linking strongly to befriending services or similar volunteering services, maybe as well, Lauren?
In terms of the services I visited overseas, I think that wasn't something that came up so much, but I know that that is something that happens in the UK, that some services, whether they're Meals on Wheels services, lunch clubs, or shopping services, are linked into befriending services. So I think it is definitely something we should recommend, because I think someone else has made the point, people shouldn't just be eating at home by themselves. It is really important that people perhaps receive Meals on Wheels someday, attend lunch clubs or other kinds of more social eating venues on other days, as well as hopefully seeing family and friends.
Yeah, and the need for volunteers or befrienders to help people come out of their homes if they're elderly, if they've got disabilities, to go to a centre is absolutely key, isn't it? Let's do a question for Joe. Madeline's asked a question, Madeline Bowes, about buying social, about the campaign Buy Social. And Madeline says, I'm working with a local lunch club that buys most ingredients from Costco. And then she goes, gah! And she says, I'm looking for simple leaflets that could guide different value judgments in procurement to create greater impact than just getting calories into older people. laudable in its own right, but still, says Madeline. Jo, can you comment on that
Yes.
question?
So that's a great question about procurement and buy social, and so I would definitely recommend having a good browse of their website. So of SC UK Buy Social website, there are various things on there. There's a directory of social enterprises, and you can filter that so that you can find all the food ones. There's also the 50 food ones that I found that are at the back of my report. And then in terms of simple leaflets to guide value judgments, I mean, I guess, again, on the SE UK website, you'll be able to find a lot about what it means to be a social enterprise, what the values of a social enterprise are. Of course, what's difficult is if you're buying from Costco at the moment, you're going to be finding that there's a very, very good price, and what social enterprises can't always compete on is on price. But there, I would say you want to look at a combination of approaches and maybe look up Fair Share, which is a charity fighting hunger and food waste that does redistribution to frontline charities. You might want to work with them so that you could combine buying commercially with the reduction of food waste in collaboration with Fair Share.
Thanks, Jo. And that links into another question from Hilary Hamer. Is that how you pronounce your surname, Hilary? Hilary asks, for both of you actually, but let's go with Jo first. Did any of you come across a discussion of more regulated than normal handled food safety? Discussion of more regulated than normal handed food safety, either as a problem or as a support. So the whole issue of regulation. Jo, do you want to have a go on that one? That's quite tricky.
I have to say I wasn't particularly looking at the regulatory side of on this project. I was looking more on sort of commercial scaling and opportunities. But yes, I guess that is a barrier. The regulatory aspect of the food industry does mean that you have to go through an awful lot of paperwork to get yourself going. But then I guess that's something that at the moment, unless there's some kind of leaner approach or a dual way of doing this, food is food. And so we do have to, I guess, follow the same regulatory approaches. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Simon.
Just actually linking the two questions that we've just had, actually, that some of the barriers to older people or their families accepting meals, particularly in the three countries I visited, were concerns about who'd cooked the food, where it had come from, particularly in those three cultures where cooking is very important in terms of not just the social element, but also where the food's come from and how it's been prepared, etc. So actually, services being able to say this is prepared in this kitchen, we're employing, giving good jobs to local young people. The older people I saw when I went on visits were very keen to talk to people about their jobs, how they found it, but also knowing, particularly in Milan, where there's a particular effort to source as much local food from local producers, that helped older people and families to buy into the service, both sort of attitudinally and literally, and actually I think overcome some of that stigma. Actually, is again, I think, relating perhaps to the previous question about dignity as well, about older people actually feeling by accepting that meal, it's not just about them being in need, it is about them buying into a service that is giving people some good jobs, that is well prepared and is supporting local producers who in the past they would have gone to market and tried to support those producers by buying local, etc.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And there's lots of comments coming through on some of these questions. There's a really interesting question from Tilly Jarvis for Jo. I'd quite like to hear Simon answer this question as well, which is around scaling, which is a huge issue, scaling up a social enterprise. So Tilly says, did you come across any evidence that social enterprises scaling through replication rather than individual growth can create greater impact and be a more sustainable model for community enterprises?
Yes, absolutely. That's definitely one of my conclusions, is that for my own sector in impact investing, the focus on scale should not come at a price. So there are lots of examples of social enterprise models where scale happens through replication. So Hisby Supermarket, who are mentioned in my report, they've just opened their second branch of a social supermarket, but they don't want to do this. They don't want to turn into a global or a national chain of supermarkets. They want others to come to them, study their model and copy it. And so that means that they probably will never become the main competitor to Tesco, but they will really challenge the system through their model and be copied by others, which I find in some ways more exciting.
And what about overseas, Joe, in other countries?
Probably similar. So I was seeing in Peru a lot of cooperative examples where the cooperative model is the thing that goes throughout, and there's a lot of common principles, but you didn't have many macro cooperatives, for example. So they grew to a certain size, which could be quite sizable, but they didn't taking each other over. So there was an understanding that the cooperative principles were respected and replicated, but the business model itself wasn't replicated, and they weren't starting to take each other over.
Okay, so well, it'd be great to circulate your report for more detail. I'm wondering around timing of this, because we need to finish by 11:30, and I know Maddie wants to wrap up. We've got a question from Ben Reynolds, which is maybe a good way to sort of start wrapping up, to both of you, to both Joe and Simon. So the question from Ben is, do the presenters know how the projects and enterprises they visited are responding to the COVID-19 crisis? So who wants to go first on that one?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I think I haven't felt it's appropriate to check in with services, given particularly the one in Milan that I imagine is extremely busy at the moment. But when I visited both the Paris and Milan services, they have both explained to me how they have plans in place for extreme weather, so either extreme heat or extreme cold periods of the year, and that they have the potential to expand their service. They have set periods of the year when they know that's likely to happen, but they have a sort of expanded service ready to go and to open it up also, importantly, to people who might be struggling to access food for different reasons, not just because social services has identified them as particularly vulnerable. So my assumption, and it is just an assumption, is that those services are well equipped to respond to the current situation, because they already have that ability to stretch built within their business models, and have, particularly in the case of Milan, have that massive kitchen that I assume would be able to up production, because if you're producing 17 million meals a year, you can produce significantly more without that necessarily impacting very much.
Yeah, so it's similar. On my side, I would say it's all starting to move quite quickly, but the community food enterprise sector is definitely adapting its work to the virus, shifting, for example, from a community pay-as-you-feel cafe running a food surplus to a redistribution model to prepare food packages and get them to those most in need. So I'm really seeing that across the board. Worth looking up Social Bite in Scotland as one example of that, but I can really see that happening in a big way.
And including in South America, Joe?
South America haven't touched in with, they're at an earlier stage with the crisis than we are, but I suspect there will be a lot of this sort of thing. Community kitchens especially will be dealing with the crisis in that way, I suspect.
Okay, well, fantastic. We could talk all day. We're coming to the end of our session now, so I'm going to hand over to Maddie to close the webinar.
Hi, everybody. Back again. I just wanted to say thanks everyone for joining. What we'll do is we'll keep the chat going for just another minute or two beyond the time for once I wrap up in a minute here, in case anyone wants to share any further links or information or contact details with other people if you're working in a certain area and want to connect with others in your area. Simon has said we've got their email addresses and the Twitter handles of the 3 people who spoke today. And as I said at the beginning, they're all very happy for you to get in touch with them. So please don't be shy if you want. I've also just put in the chat a link to Sustain's page that's on Meals on Wheels, and particularly this is where the webinar is going to live indefinitely, or the recording of it will live, but Simon will also send out an email to everybody that includes a link and maybe some links to the reports that Caroline and Simon wrote for their fellowships. So thank you very much to Caroline, Joe, and Simon for presenting and hosting the webinar today. And also, if you're interested in more webinars from Sustain, we keep them advertised on our homepage, which I'll send the link to everyone in just a minute. But that's a great place to stay in touch. We are ramping up the number of online meetings and webinars that we do for different groups of people over the next few months. So there'll definitely be a lot more coming out from Sustain for those who want to keep in touch related to coronavirus in particular and emergency responses locally, how we can build it better for the long term in the future, and how we can how to best influence national policy as we move forward during these times. So thanks to everyone. Like I said, I'll go on mute here. I'll let the chat go for just another minute or two, and then we'll close it entirely. Have a good day.
Thanks, Maddie. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.